So good morning, everybody. My name is Trish Mosser. I am the Director of the MPA in Economic Policy Management, or PEPM as we all call it. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all. I think this is going to be a great panel discussion this morning. It's wonderful it's been very difficult, as everybody knows. This is a wonderful gathering, partly because it has been so difficult in the last year and a half. One of the few upsides, actually, of all of this is the fact that we can use this technology to get together a much broader and a much larger group of alums than we otherwise would have. I got to say, even when we're ready to do this in person, I think one of the lessons of the last year and a half is going to be that we're still going to have gatherings like this simply because we can get so many more people. We have a great panel. And so I am going to be really brief with opening remarks, but I thought I'd take a couple of minutes and say a few words about what's been going on in PEPM recently, since this is one of the big broader gatherings of this reunion. But I'll keep my little update about PEPM fairly brief. What can one say? This has been a crazy, exhausting, challenging, and sometimes, frankly, sad year. Columbia, SEBA, and PEPM in particular have adapted to this in ways that, frankly, I wouldn't have imagined beforehand. And it has been a big adjustment. For the last year, a significant majority of SEPA and PEPM classes have been taught online. That's something I certainly never imagined. A notable number of them have been taught in what we call a hybrid format, meaning with the professor and some of the students in the classroom and the rest online. Part of that was for social distancing reasons, but a lot of it was because, particularly in PEPM, people just literally couldn't get here. They couldn't get to New York. The embassies and consulates were shut, so people couldn't get visas, even if there were airplane flights. So it was very difficult, and it's been a big adjustment, but also an interesting learning process. I mentioned one of the things we've learned, which is how to use this kind of technology a lot better. That's for sure. But from a teaching standpoint, it's been interesting because how do you keep your classes relevant and interested and particularly engaging when the majority of people are on a screen? And some folks have to attend really late at night, which is given the time zone differences. So there are no easy answers to those questions. But I will say that the adaptability of the students, of PEPM students in particular, since they were in many different locations, and the faculty, and I got to say, our hats off to the IT departments. If you could see a classroom today, you'd barely recognize it. There are 2 or 3 enormous screens, microphones everywhere, 3 cameras in a big classroom for the professor, for the students, for the screen. It's by a university classroom standard, they're all very high tech, and they did this basically this entire adjustment over last summer. So I got to say, hats off to both the education teaching part of Columbia University and particularly the IT folks. PEPM had some additional challenges. Obviously, having a lot of students from overseas has been a challenge. Also, because of the pandemic and the travel restrictions, we shifted the entire 2020-2021 class forward by 1 semester. So instead of starting in the summer, as we have for many, many years, last year's class, the class that is graduating, started in September with everyone else. So they are finishing now. They literally have finals next week. They're about to graduate. So for the first time in a really, really long time, we actually have 2 PEPM classes here at the same time over the summer, the incoming class for next year and the outgoing class. That's actually been kind of a treat because our PEPM classes don't get to meet each other that often. And so, yeah, while they're students. So that's actually been kind of cool. So in addition to all of those emergency preparations, I want to highlight a couple of other things that have been going on for the last few years and I think they're very relevant for certainly where PEPM is today and also where it's headed. The first is about the curriculum and making the curriculum more flexible. One of the ways we have done that is to expand the focus areas where students can focus their electives. And we now have 3, the traditional economic policy management, more develop-oriented, energy and the environment, which we added a number of years ago. And then 4 years ago, we added a focus area in central banking and financial markets. The latter one it turns out to be incredibly popular. Something like 40% of the class each year focuses their elective courses in this area. I think that's a reflection of probably the global interconnected nature of the economies and the financial markets in recent years, and financial policy for that matter. So in that sense, I guess it's not a surprise, but it's been rewarding to know that we added it and it's been so popular. We are currently in the process of considering adding another focus area on sustainable development and ESG to the curriculum. And I have to say that's partly at the urging of an alumni advisory group that grew out of last year's reunion. Now, we're not there yet, for one thing, because how do I put this? The financial restrictions in the university have put on us are limiting how many new courses and new things we can do in the short run. But we are seriously considering it and may very well do it in the future. The second item I want to mention is recruitment of new students. We continue to strive to attract the very, very best students from all around the world, and to ensure that if they're admitted, they can come. As many of you are very well aware, a major recruitment tool and a key source of funding over the years for PEPM has been the Joint Japan World Bank Scholarship Program. But that scholarship program is shrinking. It's been shrinking actually for a number of years, and it's going to continue to shrink in the future. And as a result, we have broadened out very significantly our recruitment efforts in the last few years to both the private sector and the public sector, particularly in emerging markets, and to continue to attract the very best students. PEPM is now a STEM designated program, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Which is very good for overseas students because it allows an additional 3 years of practical training after you graduate in the United States, is included in your visa. We hope that's going to be a big attraction for the program. But that's all of the things we've done so far we really still need your help. You are the best ambassadors and the best recruitment tool we have. To be cheerleaders, to be ambassadors, et cetera, for the program. And so we encourage you to talk about PEPM with your peers, your colleagues, and so forth. And if you need anything from us, if you have someone who you think would be good for the program, just let us know. We're happy to speak to them about it. Last and not least, we need to help students pay for this. So in the past year, we have launched several efforts to raise scholarship funds. And just so you're forewarned, you're all going to just now get a pitch from me about this. And I want to particularly thank a couple of groups. First of all, our PEPM alum, Haitao Zhai, class of 2000, who has given his support to this effort, and also a small group of alums who have been helping us to brainstorm and to make further connections for scholarship and fellowship efforts. If you'd like to contribute to any of these efforts, again, just let us know. We'd be happy to hear from you. Finally, here's the personal pitch. Each year when SEBA does its money for fundraising, if you are inclined to contribute, you can designate that money directly for PEPM and PEPM only, and all of the funds that come into PEPM are used for scholarships. So if you're inclined, and the next time you hear from SEPA, I think the next time will probably be in early November. Is that right, David? For the Giving Day. Please do think of us, and please do think of the students. We promise we'll put it to very good use. Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to see you all. And now I'm going to turn it over to David Caughlin, the Associate Director of PEPM, for those of you who don't know him. But everybody who does know him knows that he's the absolute heart and soul of PEPM program. And he's going to be running the panel. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you so much, Trish. That was great. So yes, as Trish said, I'm David Caughlin. I'm the Associate Director of the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our panelists this morning. Our panel is on post-COVID economic growth and sustainable development, and each of the panelists is taking a very different look at that question. And so I think it'll be a very interesting panel. We're limiting the initial remarks to 10 minutes so that we can go quickly into Q&A and have participation from the alums that are on. And let me just very quickly introduce our panelists. We'll start off with Ketleen Florestal, who's from our class of 1997. Ketleen, after graduating, went back to her home of Haiti and held several high-level public positions, and then has been working for, I want to say, nearly 20 years at the IMF and World Bank. And she's coming to us from DC today. And Ketleen will start us off. She'll be focusing on the lowest income countries and looking at key challenges and opportunities faced by them as advanced economies move to recovery and growth. And then we will have Haitao Zhai, who's coming to us from Beijing today. Haitao is from the class of 2000, and about 10 years after graduating, he, together with others, started up Primavera Capital Management and is currently a partner at Primavera, and has been doing well in that work for the last 10 years, 11 years. And Haitao will focus on how the pandemic changed China's growth model and highlight some of the real-time examples of that. And then we will turn it over to Amarjeet Singh. Amarjeet is Executive Director at the Securities and Exchange Board of India, where I want to say, Amarjeet, you've been working there for quite some time, almost 20 years as well, and rising to a very responsible position at SEBI. And Amarjeet will focus on the global agenda for sustainable development, and he'll be looking at sustainable investments from the fund's asset management perspective, and then sustainability disclosures. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Ketleen to start us off. Ketleen?
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I would like to first thank David, Trish, and the PEPM team for organizing the reunion events and also for having me in this panel. Before I start, I'd like to refer to Trish's introduction on a personal note about the importance of PEPM, I think, in my life and in my colleagues' life of the class of 97. This is one of the strongest links we've kept our class. We are scattered around the world from all continents, and we keep in touch, sometimes loosely, sometimes more when there is a big event in the world, like the pandemic, or everybody taking vaccines, exchanging information and notes, or when somebody is traveling to another country asking for contact. So it has become a real support group, more for some and more for others. I'm very glad to hear this morning Trish update us and everybody on where PEPM is at and the the modifications that have happened over the years to the PEPM program and access to the PEPM program with many positive notes. That said, I would like to start. I see that there is a very diverse a group of participants, diverse in the terms of area of focus. And as David mentioned, these are initial remarks. I've kept it very simple, even if it's an economic presentation. I am sparing you from all the statistics, but I want to give, this was meant to be a global introduction to the topic itself. So basically to raise the issues about opportunities and challenges. Hence, I would like, before I even start talking about the post-COVID era, to underscore the key assumptions of the presentation that I'm about to make. First, I think that we must posit that today, no country can be considered in a post-COVID-19 era. Some nations are currently facing their most alarming infection rates, while a significant number of other countries are dealing with second, third waves of the pandemic, and at times due to the presence of some of the deadlier variants. Also, most of you would agree, I suppose, that in an interconnected world, no country will be safe until all countries are safe. Geographic barriers to entry have been practiced during the past year and are still in place in many parts of the world. While they may save lives and prevent direct casualties from COVID-19, they also come with severe impact on economic activity and social indicators. We concur, as is generally asserted by economic analysts and development partners, that economic recovery is highly dependent on the course of the pandemic. The latter is itself intimately linked to the speed of vaccination rollouts. The statistics indicate an increased divergence of low-income countries from the growth path of advanced economies, and estimated cost of returning to the convergence path of advanced economies is elevated. And trillions of dollars have been estimated in a study recently in 2021. I didn't include the reference here, so I can't give it to you, but I can always give the reference. Study done by the IMF, and some more refinement done by the World Bank concerning subgroups. But the figure that has been quoted, which is already quite alarming and astounding, does not even include the resources required to catch up on the Sustainable Development Goals that we may all recall were supposed to be met by 2030. And we may also recall that many leaks were already behind in meeting many of the achieving the SDGs. Moreover, right now, I did mention that the vaccination rollout is one of the most important factors under the path of the pandemic. However, what is concerning is that leaks, in many cases, have barely covered 1% of their population, and others are aggressively trying to take full advantage of the COVAX initiative, the COVAX facility, which helps countries, leaks, and some lower middle income countries to negotiate and access vaccines and also finance vaccines. The initial ambition of the COVAX initiative was to finance about 20% of the population of low-income countries. This has gone up since then, and there are many other plans because leaks have realized, although leaks are trying to tap into different sources of supply for the vaccines. In Africa, for example, we have many countries who are tapping into COVAX and then tapping into some initiative of the African Union, who also have secured millions of vaccines. So there is an aggressive, there is a diligence now, an aggressive diligence, both by low-income countries and by most advanced countries who are helping by donating vaccines to make them more available for low-income countries. For the rollout, it is not only that the vaccine need to be made available, and we just acknowledge that the constraints have been slightly diminished lately because of actions for those who produce and who have purchased early significant quantities of the vaccine, and those are mostly most advanced economies, to donate millions of vaccines and make financing more available for the rollout for the vaccination campaign. And I will insist that in addition to having access to the vaccines, countries also face the challenge of reaching the population, customarily referred to as getting the jabs in their arms. Vaccination campaigns are costly, and this one even costlier in a sense because of the barriers to circulation or the circuit to go from one place to the other, even within country. Even more complicated because some of the vaccines require infrastructures that many countries don't have in terms of temperatures that the vaccines have to be kept in. They also require new knowledge for medical personnel. So I will insist, so it's not just a question of accessing vaccines, it's also a question of being able to carry out the vaccination campaign. And there is the other challenge in a number of low-income countries, including my own, which is to convince reticent populations, and I shouldn't have said just in low-income countries because this is also true even in the US and in other advanced countries, but in low-income countries, some have faced a first period of stigmatizing people who were COVID-19 positive, and now they also have to face the reticence of populations to go and get vaccinated even when it is available. In addition to the cost of the pandemic, in terms of the infection rates and fatalities, another important factor would be the adequacy, size, timing, and contents of response packages to the pandemic. We witnessed during the past year and a half or so that countries that had sufficient buffers, mostly in terms of fiscal space, were more able to shield their populations from the ire of the pandemic. The responses included strengthening social safety nets and supporting businesses, as well as relaxing prudential norms to facilitate the financial system. Today, after more than a year with the pandemic, leaks are left with reduced fiscal space and external buffers, despite having received, in some cases, significant support from the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions, IFIs, and other development partners. Fiscal revenues have registered deep falls, and domestic revenue potentials have shrunk substantially, including because of the significant fall or disappearance of key economic activities. Damages are not limited to the fiscal nor the short-term economic indicators that economic indicators can grab. We spoke at the beginning about the divergence from the growth path of advanced economies. And we must insist on what has been called, measured in some cases, losses of decades of development gains. A key term summarizing those irrecuperable losses is scarring. You may have heard in the press, at least in the economic press, about scarring. The scarring of the pandemic include losses in human capital and economic infrastructures that impact potential growth. Previously, we noted how those who had buffers and had responded early and comprehensively to the pandemic tended to be less scarred and more able, we didn't use the word scarred, but that's what we were saying, and more able to recover in the short term or now. Probably are the first ones in line to go to the recovery phase. The future also depends today on the adoption of appropriate policies, both by the governments of the affected countries and the support they are able to receive. In other words, by the government themselves and by the development community also. In this regard, it must be underscored that the most impacted countries have been the most vulnerable to shocks. The least developed countries, small states, and countries in fragile situations, which I would say, I mean countries who are subject to violence and conflict, where conflict and violence are prominent. These are typically called FCS or FCV countries, at least in the World Bank and IMF. The COVID-19 impact has differed per country, and I don't think it's superfluous to repeat. They have differed depending on, one, the country's starting point. We refer here to the strength of its institutions in the health sector and others, the size of its fiscal and external buffers, as well as the resilience of its financial and private sectors. In effect, the countries with the most buffers were more able to implement early and promptly a comprehensive package to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on households and businesses. And their estimated impact on both, including both potential as well as on poverty, are more tempered. A third factor were measures that were taken in response packages and development partner support. These are the three, I would say, biggest group that we look at as we look forward to the recovery and sustainable growth and going back to the path of sustainable growth. We must underscore in this quest for sustainable growth at this juncture, where most developed countries are going towards a path of recovery, despite the resurgence of the pandemic with new variants, we must underscore the tremendous role that the international community, particularly the multilateral development banks and other financial institutions, have played, and the central role they must still play. The roles of the MDBs are critical for the provision of financial support and for sharing critical knowledge and delivering policy advice, including through technical assistance operations. Trish mentioned at the beginning how Columbia University has been transformed in their classes, and how we are able to gather more people in our reunions and meet more often because of the hybrid or virtual mode. And this is also something that the international community, the MDBs, were able to achieve despite the pandemic, deliver more technical assistance and share advice and convene meetings and support the authorities. And that must continue because, as we all know, this is a crisis like no other. There are no real historic examples to take lessons from. We can take bits of lessons, but the size of the pandemic, its comprehensiveness has never been experienced before. So allow me to summarize before I go to the opportunities, the challenges at hand: increasing divergence from sustainable growth paths, elevated food insecurity, which I did not particularly pinpoint, but which is important, particularly in the least developed countries. The elevated food insecurity is often linked, besides natural disasters regularly faced by those countries in the past, such as droughts or locust infestation, etc., but also interruptions in the supply chains. and losses in human capital due to the pandemic, diminished fiscal space, worsening debt indicators, disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable. Here, I should underscore the disproportionate impact on women, including because of their high representation in the informal economy. So more gender imbalance than before the pandemic. And this was already on the agenda of development partners because gender balance, gender equity in economic activities makes economic sense. It's not just a word or a fad. It makes economic sense if all potential economic agents can participate in the economy and on an equal footing, more or less. The second group of challenges, in my view, is that of designing and implementing timingly, meaning at the appropriate time, the policies, the adequate policies, with cautious attention to the timing for withdrawal of existing support measures, whether it be to households, businesses, or the financial sectors. As some of you may have witnessed or known from your own countries, that many of our countries were taught that the pandemic was behind them. My country is a good example where during the first year, we didn't have high infection rates. We're even talking about, oh, wow, trying to find explanation why Haiti was, even though institutions, the health sector is, the institutions in the health sector and institutions in general are not scoring at the highest level in generally typified as being weak. We have a weak health sector, but COVID infection rates were very low. Death rates were even lower, much lower than would have been expected for a country in a fragile situation, an FCS country, and moreover, a least developed countries. And a country going through a lot of other strife, I would say, uncertainty, but we didn't have elevated. And then suddenly, in about 3 or 4 months ago, we were hit by one of the variants, and the infrastructures that were put in place were kind of demobilized because we didn't have that many patients. Yes, I'm running out of time.
Yes.
Okay, let me just try to wrap up as soon as possible and say that the third challenge I will underscore is that of reinvigorating the private initiative despite prevailing high degree of uncertainty. Challenges in lakes faced in this crisis, like no other, abound, and references to previous crises only yield limited guidance. One of the most salient characteristics is the global aspect of the crisis provoked by the pandemic, and the fact that most advanced economies, donor countries, are also impacted and facing huge challenges. So most concerning today is that we have a focus on recovery, while many countries are still in the emergency phase. For FCS countries and small states, the challenges are intensified by the fact that they also have to face other and at times multiple shocks, such as natural disasters and conflict and violence. In addition, their path to return to fiscal and debt sustainability is not clear, given that many of them were not able to take advantage of the debt relief initiatives. Small states also particularly tend to have an economic base limited to one or a couple of economic activities such as tourism or at times commodity exports. Tourism-dependent economies and all relying mostly on high contact sectors were most impacted and may not be able to diversify in the short term. And to finish on a positive note, I would say that the pandemic is also an opportunity for leagues to reset their economies by adopting policies that would enhance resilience, including to climate change, in our development jargon, to build back better and greener economies. It is an opportunity to enhance digitalization capabilities and leverage them in order to adapt to a different international trade order and interruptions in domestic supply chains. The MDBs have deployed the strongest packages of support since the beginning of the pandemic, and they are flexing their muscles to help countries to the recovery and towards sustainable growth path. Both the IMF and the World Bank have launched substantial efforts to multiply their capacity to support LICs, both financially and technically, including by strengthening their collaboration with other international partners, regional development banks. In our view, LICs should do their best to understand what is being offered and what are the eligibility criteria and conditions to take full advantage of this historic movement towards growth and sustainable development in a greener space. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ketleen. Now we'll turn to Haitao Zhai, who will speak about China's growth model and challenges presented by COVID-19. Haitao?
Thank you, David. And also thank you, Trish, for inviting me to this virtual reunion. Although I do look forward to the one David mentioned on March 26th. I hope there'll be a real reunion. I do look forward to meeting you in person. But let me first echo the point made by Ketleen about how PEPM changed our lives. To me, particularly, I think PEPM is the most rewarding experience. Not only has PEPM program benefited my career path tremendously, but probably more importantly, we had our first child while we were studying at Columbia. So for that, my wife and I are always grateful to PEPM. So as a China-based investor, I like to share with you today how the Chinese economy has responded to this pandemic and how the growth model has evolved as a result. But I'll be brief in my remarks. China is the only major economy to achieve positive growth in 2020, thanks to effective but often harsh measures like testing, contact tracing, and large-scale vaccination. The economy managed to rebound fairly quickly and strongly, with growth project to exceed 8% by the end of this year, and hopefully return to its pre-COVID trend growth rate of about 5% by next year. More importantly, this pandemic has brought about some fundamental structural changes, which will make the post-COVID economy look quite different from the past. First, the economy will be more digital. Technology was already reshaping the economic landscape before COVID-19 struck, but now this trend is becoming more eminent and has clearly accelerated. Secondly, the economy is becoming more green. The government has set a very ambitious goal to reach carbon emission peak by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2060. It is expected that many low-end manufacturing, heavy polluting industries will be forced to close down or phased out. Thirdly, China is beefing up its own capabilities in technology innovation, both to counter the heightened pressure by the US for decoupling and also to mitigate the impact of the prolonged COVID pandemic. Taken together, these forces are further driving the long-term structural shifts in China's economic growth model, from previously export-led, government investment-driven to one driven by services, the domestic consumption and technology. We will see a new growth pattern of quality over speed and sustainability oriented. Let me briefly talk about the impact of new technology on the consumer economy, supply chain, and healthcare sector in particular, with some real-time examples. Even before the pandemic, China's digital economy is arguably the most sophisticated in the world. For example, mobile payment penetration is 3 times that of the United States. It is also the world's largest e-commerce market, accounting for roughly 45% of global retail e-commerce in 2018. COVID-19 created a so-called stay-at-home economy, forcing changes in consumer behavior and also business strategies. According to some market survey, the usage of the delivery apps surged by something like 15 to 20% during the peak of the crisis last year. More than half of the consumers surveyed would continue buying groceries online even after the pandemic. When consumers were not able to leave their homes, companies pioneered some new methods of online marketing, such as engaging so-called key opinion leaders on live stream events to acquire new customers and engage with existing ones. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Alibaba's flagship e-commerce platform, Taobao, has registered an average of 30,000 live streaming merchants per day. These new ways of shopping and engaging with customers are likely to continue in the post-pandemic world. Companies are also refining their internal business procedures and processes, as well as supply chain management by using new disruptive technologies. China's well-established logistical infrastructure and capability has played actually a very big part in ensuring smooth functioning of the economy and protecting social welfare during the lockdown period last year. One of our portfolio companies, Yum China, which is the holding company of KFC and the Pizza Hut operations in China, was among the first restaurant chain companies to introduce contact-free delivery and pickup services. They provide free meals to support medical workers across China. To give you another example, consumer drones allowed isolated communities to access food and other essential goods. So deliveries that used to take hours could be cut down to just in a matter of 10-15 minutes with a special drone delivery corridor set up during the pandemic. While it is still unlikely that drone delivery can be implemented on a large scale, this type of new technologies does create new opportunities for business process and supply chain management going forward. The COVID pandemic also accelerated adoption of digital technologies in the healthcare sector. Many existing medical tech players massively scaled up their online consultation visits during the lockdown period. For example, within 3 months last year, Ping An Good Doctor, one of the major players online platform, attracted more than 1 billion consultation visits. Another one called We Doctor, which is owned by WeChat, Tencent, increased the number of doctors on its platform by more than 30-fold. The public health sector also joined force by opening online offshoots of established hospitals and also facilitating digital claim system for basic medical insurance. In addition, the use of delivery drones again allowed medical samples to be transported with minimum human contact, cutting down on the time and resources needed for transportation. Drones were also used to spray aerial disinfectants in public spaces, which is obviously much more effective than an hand spray. So such new technologies enhance efficiency, improve public health, and are likely to continue beyond the pandemic period. As I said before, China is building a green economy. We have already observed a downward trend in carbon emissions in the past decades, with emissions growth falling from 9% in the 2000s to 1% in the 2010. Now a national emissions trading scheme, ETS, is already being rolled out across the country. If and when fully implemented, this scheme will become the largest carbon emission trading system in the world. And at the same time, the government will significantly reduce the subsidies and support of carbon-intensive industries. So this will create additional driver for the economy to become more consumption services oriented and environmentally friendly. Corporate ESG effort, as Ketleen already pointed out, is another key ingredient in the transition to a carbon neutral economy. Currently, only companies listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange are required to issue ESG reports. But now in mainland China Stock Exchange, we have seen more and more blue chip companies following suit voluntarily. And on the other hand, China-based asset managers and institutional investors like us are also increasingly committing to the global ESG standards on the voluntary basis. For example, when we at Primavera Capital, when we make investment decision, when we evaluate every investment opportunity, we require the global ESG standard for the target companies that we are going to invest. So it is likely that the two domestic stock exchanges will also follow Hong Kong in doing so in the near future. According to a recent study by Goldman Sachs, in order to achieve carbon neutral in 2060, China will have to invest probably something like 15 to 16 trillion US dollars in green infrastructure investments, including renewable power, EV infrastructure, carbon capture, so on and so forth. So the clean tech revolution is clearly well on the way. And this trend will also is going to provide a new promising investment opportunities for investors like us. To conclude, digital and green are the two words that I will like to use to describe the future engines of the Chinese economy. The new technologies pioneered during the pandemic will continue to drive China's booming startup ecosystem. Last but not least, all these changes must be supported by a well-functioning financial system, including a sound and efficient capital market, so that capital will flow to the most productive sectors and investment opportunities. But this subject is, is so important that I think we'll deem another opportunity to discuss. So let me stop here, and thank you, David and Trish, again for inviting me to this reunion.
Thank you, Haitao. That was very nice. Okay, now we'll turn to Amarjeet Singh, who will be speaking on the global agenda for sustainable development and key issues affecting Indian markets. So Amarjeet, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thanks to you and Patricia for inviting me to this event today. It's indeed a pleasure, let me say that, to connect to PEPM community almost after 2 decades. I passed out in 2002, and thinking about it, it was a very special year, maybe for good or bad reasons, because we witnessed September 11, the Twin Tower fell and the whole life in New York City changed. So I have many memories of those times. But anyway, thanks a lot for having me here. Turning to my remarks on the sustainability issues. So let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not exactly a sustainability expert, so to say. But in my job, I've been working on sustainability disclosure issues from the regulatory side. As a regulator of the capital markets, we have disclosure requirements. We are a disclosure-based regulator. So for the last year and a half, I've been engaged in this work. So maybe I'd like to share some of those insights. But nonetheless, a lot is happening in the sustainability space today. So climate change or inclusive growth or sustainable economy, these are the words you hear so much more now than you heard them earlier. And what has happened is, I don't think this is new, so to say, but COVID-19 has actually, brought in a greater urgency in this movement, of the climate issues and the sustainable growth issues. So what it is doing, to my mind, for the both the developed world and more so perhaps for the developing world, is that these sustainability issues are sharply redefining the development needs and development strategies and development priorities. So this, in turn has a lot of implications for the world of finance. So just to sort of, elaborate on what I'm trying to say, we need to reassess today the quantum of development capital which is required for development in the coming years. We need to revisit how this capital is getting allocated. So allocation of capital, to my mind, is a very key area for all the countries. We need to rethink whether the current structures and current instruments which are available for raising of capital, are they adequate, or do you need certain new frameworks? Similarly, on the reporting side, where I would like to spend more time, whether the current framework of reporting, is it adequate or not? So I'll focus on two dimensions. One is sustainability investments, and secondly, the ESG reporting or the sustainability reporting. As I said, my perspective is more from the corporate and the asset management side. So just to give you some numbers, in terms of how the sustainable investments from the asset management industry, how they have grown very sharply in the last 2-3 years. And this is actually quite remarkable. I have some data points. First, let me talk globally. So the total assets in sustainability funds increased from USD 550 billion at the beginning of 2018 to USD 960 billion at the end of 2019. So roughly over 2 years, you see such a massive increase. Now comes 2020 when the COVID started. So in the first 3 months of COVID-19, ESG funds continued to witness inflows, whereas, in the other segments, we were seeing outflows. So $45.6 billion was, brought into the ESG areas as compared to global outflows of USD 385 billion for the overall fund universe. So while the funds were being withdrawn, but in the ESG side, investing was increasing. And since then, we've been witnessing some fantastic growth in this space. So now the total assets, just moving forward to 2020. So the total assets in the sustainable funds stood at USD almost $2 trillion at the end of March 2020, which is an increase of almost 260% over a period of 3 years. Now, if you look at the geographical concentration of these funds, so these funds actually are mostly concentrated in Europe. They account for 81% of sustainable assets, followed by funds in US, which account for 13.4%. Talking about India, here, what we've seen interestingly on the asset management side, we have 9 ESG themed funds in the market today. And out of which 7 were actually launched only in the last 1 year, during the COVID year. So obviously, fund managers are seeing an appetite for ESG investing and they are launching those kind of schemes. So there are 2 main forces, which drive the ESG world. One is investors who are pushing for ESG investings, and they're also seeking greater accountability from companies they invest in. And to my mind, that is the main driving force. And the second, of course, is governments and regulators like us who are also contributing, in their own limited ways to these trends. As a regulator, let me at the same time say we are agnostic. We don't tell investors where they should invest. It is for investor to choose where he wants to invest. We are not saying that you go for ESG investing as such, because we are also concerned about there could be, greenwashing, mis-selling, and those kind of issues. But we do have, our role to play in the area of ESG disclosure. So globally, what we are witnessing is that there is a greater push on ESG disclosures from regulators across the world. And so far, as Haitao also mentioned, different markets are seeing more and more disclosures coming out. So far, the disclosures were more in the voluntary space, but now we see a movement more towards the mandatory space. You're not leaving it to the choice of the companies to disclose what they want to disclose. You are having more and more disclosure templates, and you are actually mandatorily required to disclose. Just to give you some sort of sense of some state of play, around the world on this. In UK, for example, the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, UK has announced that economy-wide mandatory climate-related disclosures will be in place by financial year 2024-25. In Europe, Europe is ahead of many markets. In April this year, they've adopted a proposal that is called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And basically what it will do is it will extend the scope of reporting to all the large companies and all listed companies in regulated markets. They will have to, make disclosures on sustainability issues. And they're also, with this directive, they've also introduced more detailed reporting requirements. And this is more on the mandatory side than on the voluntary side. And not only that, in fact, Europe is also taking the lead in terms of requiring the companies to also give some assurance on those disclosures. One part is you disclose, but another part is some third-party assurance or audit of those disclosures. So some limited assurance element would also be required going forward. New Zealand, again, has made announcements for mandatory disclosures by both listed equity and debt issuers by 2023. In Asian jurisdiction, Hong Kong has mandatory disclosures on board statement and significant climate issues that impact the issuer. In Taiwan, again, you have mandatory disclosures. In US, SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, has also recently announced its intention. I must say in US, the progress is rather slow on this, but its intention to enhance its focus on climate-related disclosures. But with the change in the political leadership, we are seeing more traction on these issues than it was earlier. One of the biggest challenges in the sustainability disclosure space is that you have multiplicity of disclosure standards. So, you have, the reason for that is there is no common global reporting standard, but now efforts are being made towards that. So you have SASB, TCFD, CDSB, GRI. I mean, I'll not go into those details in the interest of time. So there's a bit of overcrowding in those privately disclosure frameworks which are available, but they are renowned frameworks which have been in place. And to my mind, why those frameworks are being used? Because the governments and regulators lag behind. and there was no common international standard. So you had these private non-profit sort of, initiatives by the industry. So, but now moving towards, there's an increasing convergence of the sustainability disclosure standards. So, 5 standard setters, they have decided, they are SASB, CDSB, GRI, IIRC, and CDP. They've all announced their intention to work together. Then we are also seeing merger of a couple of, these standard setters. And I think it's very important for the information of this group. IFRS Foundation is working towards establishing a sustainability standards board. And this would be announced in the upcoming COP26 meeting in November this year. So that board will actually evolve a common global template for disclosures. So there's a lot of buzz around that amongst the regulators on this. Now, let me very quickly come to sustainability reporting in India before I conclude. In India, we've been, if I can say, a bit ahead of the curve. We introduced sustainability disclosure requirements way back in 2012, but it was limited only for 100 companies, top 100 companies. And made it mandatory from day one, because in our market, we believe, the self-regulation doesn't work so much as the mandatory requirements work. So we progressively increased from 100, we brought it to 1,000 companies by 2019. And India is, India is committed to the Paris Accord and also to Sustainability Development Goals. So we decided that our disclosure template is rather inadequate, and 2 years back we decided to work on it and review and enhance the disclosure and make it more comparable, more data oriented, and so on. So we thoroughly reworked, and we had extensive consultation with the industry. And after that, few months back only, we've notified our new requirements. These are called business responsibility and sustainable reporting requirements, BRSR. As I was saying, there is a quantifiable matrix for easy measurement and comparability. It has disclosures on climate and social related issues. It has about 500 data points. And while developing this framework very quickly, we've kept our ground realities in mind. So our approach has been having a climate plus requirements. It's not just climate. In Europe, US, there's a lot of emphasis on climate. So we are also for climate, but we want to go a little beyond climate. And the reasons, if you look at our rankings in the human, there's a lot of social disparities and social inequalities. So we can't neglect those issues. Our rankings in, Human Development Index, or in the, the Inclusive Development Index of World Economic Forum, rankings are pretty low. So with that in mind, we very consciously followed a climate plus approach, where the metrics goes beyond climate, and it also has social metrics and like workforce diversity, health, safety of employees, employee engagement, welfare measures, social impact assessment of undertaken by the companies. How are you treating the marginalized or the vulnerable groups, CSR spending? So there are a number of issues. On the climate side, we have disclosure requirements on energy consumption, water withdrawal, water consumption, air emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And we have, we've said this year, this template will be voluntary, but next year, from 22-23, this template is going to be mandatory. And we've also provided for interoperability, just to, take care of the concerns around ease of doing business. If a company is already disclosing as per an acceptable international standard, it just has to cross-refer. So there are a lot of overlaps in the disclosure requirements. So you can cross-refer, and that will be taken as compliance. Just to conclude, just to say something very fundamental, the ideas of ecological responsibility or reverence for all life or equality, inclusivity, these are, you know, not new to us as mankind. And I mean, in India, we've grown up with these ideas. But what has happened is the way we are seeing the devastation. You've seen recently flash floods in Europe, flash floods in China also. You've seen every day you are hearing, and then your forest fires in the West Coast in US recently. So I mean, all these issues are now we are confronted with it. So it is not just a mere talk. We have to deal with it on a very, very urgent basis. That is why the society's expectations, again, coming back to the corporate perspectives, society's expectations from companies are rising. So they are not just expecting companies to be profitable, but they're also expecting companies to be responsible. And so these expectations have been rising. And I personally see this is only going to gain more traction. And financial reporting is no longer enough. You have to go to non-financial reporting, and the sustainable reporting is an essential piece of non-financial reporting. So all this activity is very, very healthy and very positive, I think, for all of us. I'll stop with that. Sorry if I've taken more time.
Thank you, Amarjeet, and thank you again to Ketleen and Haitao as well. We started late, and so we're already past 9, but I want to give the other alums a few minutes to ask any questions on these great presentations. So let's take, if you can, another 5 to 10 minutes just for Q&A before we close. If any of the alums want to ask any questions, just raise your hand, either your physical hand or your little blue Zoom hand, and I will ask you to unmute and ask your question. And I have a couple of questions in my pocket, but I want to give you a chance to ask them first. Well, let me go ahead then. A first question to Ketleen. What are some of the opportunities for LICs at the World Bank and IMF, Ketleen?
Thank you, David. I'll try to be as quick as possible because this could be a whole other session. The opportunities at World Bank and IMF, of course, depends on how governments themselves take in charge the governance of their countries. But we went through an emergency phase where billions of dollars were disbursed for almost all members who asked for it. Emerging markets, low income, but among low income countries, there were through the instrument called RCFs, which is a concessional instrument for crisis response at the IMF, which usually they use for natural disasters. They used it for the Ebola epidemic, and now they use it for the COVID. But now we need a new stage where countries are invited to go into more structural programs where you can get financing by having a program. But as you must have all heard in the press, there was also the bold decision and welcome decision to do a DTS, special drawing SDR allocation, which means basically making available foreign currency to all the members. So the ones that need it will use it. And the others have the option of rechanneling that to either give more money to the fund for concessional financing or to other ideas, maybe to fight for climate change. At the World Bank side, it's also extraordinary what was able to be done. People may know that the World Bank Fund, there's the World Bank Group, but the World Bank Fund for the poorest countries is called IDA, the International Development Association. So it's replenished every 3 years. During the pandemic, for the first time, we were at IDA 19. They had reduced it to 2 years so that one, they could advance the disbursement that was already programmed, meaning the envelope, the 85 billion that was already programmed, which is grants and loans, concessional loans, They reduced it to 2 years, and we are in the process of negotiating a new envelope of IDA 20. And this new envelope, the ask is very high from countries and from the World Bank Group. While being conscious that donors have problems, it is hard touching that donor countries that, although they have problems, they are willing to look at replenishing the IDA. And they are addressing the pandemic with policies. It's still in negotiations, making possible windows to address food security directly, and maintaining or upscaling IDA support to FCS countries. But all in all, working at those two institutions during the pandemic, there was a big effort through the DSSI debt relief initiative of the G20 that they worked on, but the IMF's all CCRT debt relief, the World Bank Group, because of many reasons that I can explain now, couldn't do debt relief, but they have tried to ensure that there are positive net flows. And there's a lot going on here. The only message I would give that countries need to take in charge their macro frameworks and their policies, and be willing to do the tough measures, which is not necessarily tough, but when they gave the money, they said, spend, but keep the receipts. So there are safeguard issues. They are mandatory to report and to be transparent in what you spend, but there are a lot of opportunities right now to reset your economies and have a good plan and get support from it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam has a question. Miriam, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for your presentations. I'm actually recipient of the Joint Japan World Bank Scholarship, and it was really uncomparable experience that I have. And thanks to David and all the faculty members and everybody. So thanks for your presentations. And I have a question to Haitao. Basically, I have been working in the public sector. Now I'm in the private, but now, for example, I'm from Georgia, yeah? And everywhere in the world, especially after COVID, you see the importance of CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. And I'm just curious, because you're managing the investment fund, how do you look at it, and if there is any implication for the good of the economic development, or if there is a negative implication? So I would be interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. It's really good to meet you on Zoom. Actually, I am right now in Beijing. As you probably know, before PEPM, I did spend a couple of years working at the central bank here in China. So on this trip, I also met some of the former colleagues, and the digital currency is clearly one of the topics we discussed. China actually has taken the lead in rolling out the digital currency among all the major economies. The purpose is really simple, because as I mentioned in my remarks, the digital economy has been playing a major part in the economic growth, even before the COVID period. For example, mobile payment, as I pointed out, it is changing everyday life here in China for the business and also for the ordinary citizens. But they are also, as companies like Ant Financial and other technologies have grown very big, clearly it has also brought about some concerns, legitimate concerns in terms of data security, customer interest protection. So in that context, actually the central bank has been thinking really hard in terms of how to play a role in this process. The way it did it is kind of interesting. It actually worked. PBOC, the central bank here, has been working together with those technology companies in rolling out the digital currency. So the purpose is not to compete with those a mobile payment platform or service providers. Actually, they wanted to collaborate in terms of technology and also the purpose of protecting customer data. There's another purpose, which is to fight against the rise of Bitcoin and the like. China is very, very conservative in this context. I think it's probably the only major economy that officially publicly announced that the Bitcoin is illegal. So not only people, investors or speculators, so to speak, are discouraged from trading Bitcoins here in China. The supplies of, for example, electricity, those companies, they also under huge pressure from the central bank and also from the local government to fight against the use of Bitcoin. So it is against those background that the central bank has been really aggressive, in my view, in rolling out the digital currency. Right now, there are a couple of pilot projects in the making, but inside China. But next, I think they're gonna to include Hong Kong and Macau. So if they can roll out digital RMB into for example Hong Kong, that will further help Hong Kong to become a sort of offshore center for the RMB, and that would be a huge step, because going forward, people have been talking about making the RMB, the Chinese yuan, more international, more convertible. So I think that would be the first major step if Hong Kong will be able to include it in this digital currency scheme.
Well, we are over time. Maybe I'll leave it with just one more question to Amarjeet. Amarjeet, everyone talked a little bit about ESG. At least Trish started, Haitao mentioned it, and you spoke a bit about it. I'm wondering, how do we know that it's not just a transitory thing, that that it's just maybe greenwash, similar to that, and that we're going to keep focusing on it, and companies and investors are going to continue to work towards sustainable development through ESG. Can you convince me?
So David, that's a great question, actually. So that's where the regulators and the governments have to step in. So this is a huge risk that we are running, in the sense that ESG investing just is becoming mainstream, and you are seeing more and more funds being launched, and they're selling in the name of ESG funds. But right now we don't have the frameworks, necessary frameworks, to define what exactly is ESG investing. And why do you call an investment an ESG investment? Even the disclosures are all mostly in the voluntary space. There's no audit of those disclosures. So there's a huge risk of mis-selling around ESG funds. Just like if we go back in time, we had that wave of internet companies in 20 years back. The companies changed their names and they said we are internet companies, and we are and a lot of companies got listed even in New York Stock Exchange, and it turned out that their real business was not exactly what they were claiming to be, and there was a crash afterwards. So I think what we need, to my mind, is the more frameworks around what exactly constitutes ESG investing. You need those definitions. You need some sort of oversight, some supervision, and also how does the investor, investor won't have the capacity to understand those disclosures. Those could be very technical disclosures. So there would be some scope for data analytics or ESG ratings, but again, ESG ratings can also be misleading. And the whole issue of mis-selling. So I think greenwashing governments and regulators might be attention on disclosures. Now we are moving from disclosures to focusing on, should we bring in some sort of regulation around company in terms of how are they raising the right kind of red flags to investors? Should be told, look, this is risky. This may not give you immediate returns. Investing may not necessarily lead to higher returns in the short. We have more and more evidence which shows that ESG investing in the medium to long run could be as profitable as any other area. So I think it's an evolving field, and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered your question.
It's a very balanced answer. I like it. Thank you. Everyone, it's now time to close. I'm sorry we can't go further. But before we do, firstly, I want to say Trish got in touch with me and let me know that her internet went down, so she had to drop off. But she wanted to thank you, Amarjeet, Haitao, Ketleen, for joining us. Thanks to all of you who participated. And I also want to thank you. I also want to remind you of a few things. Later today, we have the first breakout session on economic policy management industry group led by Binish Amjad and Fernando Pimentel, who are both here. So thank you, Binish and Fernando, for doing that. And then on Sunday, we'll have the energy and environment industry group session and the central banking and financial markets industry group session. So we encourage you to come to all of those as well. And then on Monday, we start our regional breakout sessions. So I encourage you all to look into those and register if you haven't yet registered. I also note that the Asia session is being postponed to later on, but Venkateswaran, who's on the line here, is doing a superb organization of that one, and it's going to be quite exciting. So keep an eye out on that as well. I also want to mention that we are going to keep doing these virtual reunions. We may move it into September to avoid the holidays in the summer, but we'll do it each year. And then, as Haitao mentioned, we're going to have the Alumni Day activities, in-person activities each spring. And we've already set a date for the spring 2022 session for May 26th. So hold your calendars for that date. I hope many of you can come back and join us in person in spring of 2022. Thank you all for participating today. And I hope to see you on some of the breakout sessions.